The envelope arrived on a Monday morning. It looked expensive. Cold. I thought it was just a formal invitation. But when I saw my place card at the party, it didn't have my name. Just my status. Single mom. Ex-wife. And just when they thought I'd sit quietly in the corner, my 9-year-old son stood up and repeated everything they said about me behind closed doors. 1 week earlier, the morning sunlight streamed through the faded curtains of Audrey Mitchell's modest apartment. At 42, she had mastered the art of efficiency, moving between the cramped kitchen and small dining table with practiced grace. The aroma of freshly made pancakes filled the air as she prepared breakfast for her 9-year-old son, Mason. "Mom, did you see my science project notes?" Mason called out, his voice still carrying that childlike innocence that made Audrey's heart swell with love despite her exhaustion. 8 years as a waitress at Le Jardin, an upscale cafe that catered to the city's elite, had taught Audrey to hide her fatigue behind a pleasant smile. She worked the morning shift starting at 5 a.m., then picked up evening hours at a local diner 3 days a week. The grueling schedule left little time for rest, but it kept a roof over their heads and food on the table since Victor had walked out of their lives 3 years ago. And yet, not once had Audrey let Mason see her break. Not when Victor left. Not even on the nights she cried into her pillow, silently begging for strength. The familiar thud of mail dropping through the slot broke her concentration. Mason, always eager to help, retrieved the envelopes from the floor. "Mom." His voice changed, suddenly hesitant. "There's something fancy here." Audrey wiped her hands on a dishcloth and took the cream-colored envelope from Mason's outstretched hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she recognized the elegant script, Eleanor Hamilton's distinctive handwriting. The envelope felt heavy, expensive, like everything associated with her former mother-in-law. With reluctant fingers, she broke the seal and pulled out a golden embossed invitation. Eleanor Hamilton's 70th birthday celebration, it announced in ornate lettering. The event would be held at the Brighton Royal Hotel, one of the most exclusive venues in the city. "Are we going to Grandma's party?" Mason asked, peering over her arm at the invitation. Memories flooded Audrey's mind, the subtle humiliations, the disapproving glances, Eleanor's constant reminders that she wasn't from their world. Victor had eventually listened to his mother, deciding that Audrey indeed wasn't suitable for his rising career trajectory. "I don't think so, honey," she said softly, placing the invitation on the counter and turning back to breakfast. Mason's face clouded with confusion. "But it says, Mitchell family right there," he pointed out, his finger touching the embossed words. "We're the Mitchells. And you always say family is important, even when it's complicated." Audrey felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd taught Mason to value family connections, to respect his father's side of the family despite the divorce. How could she now refuse to attend without contradicting everything she tried to instill in him? "Let me think about it," she said, ruffling his hair as she set his breakfast in front of him. Later that evening, after tucking Mason into bed, Audrey held the invitation again, feeling its weight, not just the heavy cardstock, but the emotional burden it carried. A part of her wanted to tear it to pieces, to protect herself from inevitable pain. But another part, perhaps the stronger part, knew that running from Eleanor and Victor would only show them they still had power over her. "We're going," she whispered to herself, a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. "We're going to hold our heads high." 1 week later, Audrey stood before her bedroom mirror in her only formal dress, a navy blue cocktail dress she'd spent half her weekly grocery budget getting professionally pressed. "You look beautiful, Mom," Mason said, already dressed in his Sunday best, khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and the clip-on tie from the thrift store. She knelt down to straighten his tie. "Remember what we talked about? Some people might not be very nice today. If you feel uncomfortable, just give me our special signal, and we'll leave." The taxi ride consumed another significant portion of her budget. As the taxi inched closer to the Brighton Royal Hotel, Audrey's mind drifted back to happier times. 7 years earlier, she had been Victor Hamilton's bride, the unlikely waitress who captured the heart of a rising executive at Meridian Biotech. They'd met when she served his table at Le Jardin. Victor had returned the next day, and the next, until finally asking her out. He'd been charming then, rebellious even, telling her how refreshing her authenticity was compared to the calculating social climbers his mother typically introduced him to. "You're real," he'd said on their third date, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's rare in my world." In the back of the taxi, Audrey closed her eyes, the memory twisting like a knife. How quickly real had transformed into unrefined once Eleanor's influence reasserted itself. Mason's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, are you thinking about Dad?" Audrey opened her eyes, surprised by his perception. "A little bit," she admitted. "Do you think he'll be happy to see us?" There was hope in his voice that made her heart ache. "I'm sure he'll be glad to see you," she answered carefully. Their monthly visits had grown increasingly infrequent, with Victor often canceling at the last minute. The taxi slowed in traffic, and Audrey's mind slipped back to the past again. She remembered the first dinner at Eleanor's Beacon Hill mansion. Victor had squeezed her hand reassuringly before they entered, but that support had evaporated like morning mist once they crossed the threshold. "So, you serve food for a living," Eleanor had said over appetizers, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "How fascinating. I suppose someone must do it." Later that night, she'd overheard Eleanor in the hallway. "She's a phase, Victor. A working-class rebellion you'll outgrow. She's not suitable for a Hamilton." Victor had defended her then. But as months passed and his career accelerated, something changed. The late-night calls from the office became more frequent. His phone would be placed face down on tables. Weekend work trips multiplied. 3 years into their marriage, shortly after Mason's 6th birthday, Victor had sat her down in their living room. His eyes had focused on the wall behind her, never meeting her gaze. "This isn't working, Audrey," he'd said, voice flat. "We come from different worlds. Mother was right, I was fooling myself to think otherwise." She remembered asking, "Is there someone else?" His pause had been answer enough. The divorce papers had arrived a week later. She'd signed them at the kitchen table, tears falling silently as Mason slept upstairs, unaware his world was fracturing. The taxi jerked to a stop at a red light, jolting Audrey back to the present. She noticed her hands were trembling. Mason was watching her with worried eyes. "Are you okay, Mom?" She forced a smile. "Just nervous, honey. Remember what you always tell me about the monsters in my closet? That being afraid is okay, but we can't let fear stop us." Audrey laughed softly. "When did you get so wise?" The months after the divorce had been brutal. Victor's financial support, while legally mandated, barely covered their basic needs. She'd taken a second job at a diner, working evenings after her shift at Le Jardin. Some nights she'd return home at midnight, bones aching, to find their babysitter asleep on the couch and Mason waiting up despite her instructions. "I wanted to make sure you got home safe," he would say, his small face serious in the dim light. One night, after working 17 hours straight, she'd found him at the kitchen table struggling with a science project due the next day. Despite her exhaustion, she'd stayed up until 3 a.m. helping him build a model solar system. His teacher had sent home a note praising his work, unaware of the cost behind it. The taxi turned onto the hotel street, and Audrey's heart began to race. The Brighton Royal stood illuminated against the darkening sky, a beacon of wealth and privilege. "We're almost there," Mason said, excitement and nervousness mixing in his voice. Audrey nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. The glamorous exterior of the hotel reminded her of everything she wasn't, everything Eleanor had always said she could never be. The taxi pulled up to the entrance, where uniformed doormen assisted guests from luxury vehicles. As they stepped out, Audrey felt the doorman's gaze flicker over them, taking in her department store dress and Mason's thrift store suit. Though his demeanor remained professional, something in his eyes changed, a subtle shift she'd grown skilled at recognizing over the years. Good evening, madam, he said, gesturing toward the grand entrance. The Hamilton celebration is through the main lobby. Audrey nodded her thanks, keeping her chin up as she guided Mason forward. Her heart was pounding so hard she wondered if he could hear it. It's like a castle, Mason whispered, eyes wide at the opulent surroundings. For a fleeting moment, Audrey saw the hotel through his innocent eyes, the crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across marble floors, the fresh flower arrangements taller than Mason himself, the elegant guests in designer clothing. It was magical rather than intimidating. She squeezed his hand. Yes, it is. Just remember, we deserve to be here as much as anyone else. As they approached the reception desk for the event, Audrey felt a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. The young woman checking names smiled professionally, but her expression faltered slightly when Audrey gave their names. One moment, please. She stepped away, whispering to an older staff member. The minutes of waiting felt endless as other guests were efficiently processed around them. Mason fidgeted beside her, sensing her discomfort. Finally, the staff returned. Yes, you are indeed on our guest list. Please, follow me. Relief washed over Audrey, but it was short-lived. As they were led toward the grand ballroom, she noticed the curious glances from other guests. Had Eleanor made their invitation public knowledge? Was she already being positioned as some form of entertainment? At the ballroom entrance, Audrey paused, taking in the scene before them. At least 100 people mingled beneath sparkling chandeliers, the women adorned in designer gowns and jewelry that probably cost more than her annual salary. Do you see Dad? Mason asked, standing on tiptoes. Audrey scanned the crowd, her stomach clenching when she spotted Victor across the room. He was laughing with a group of colleagues, a tall blonde woman in a red dress at his side. He looked successful, at ease, as if the life they'd shared had been nothing more than a brief footnote in his biography. Not yet, she lied, not wanting Mason to rush over. Let's find our table first. They followed the attendant deeper into the ballroom. Audrey felt eyes tracking their movement, heard whispers behind raised hands. The weight of judgment was familiar yet no less painful than it had been during her marriage. The attendant slowed, approaching a table near the back of the room, partially obscured by a large floral arrangement. Your table, he said, gesturing to the place cards. Audrey's steps faltered as she saw what was written on them. Her face was drained of color as she read the words, unable to believe what she was seeing. There, in elegant handwriting for all to see, her place card read, single mom/ex-wife. And beside it, Mason's card simply stated, her son. Audrey stood frozen, staring at the place cards, single mom/ex-wife, and her son. Not their names, their status. Their reduction to afterthoughts in the Hamilton narrative. Mom? What does it say? Mason leaned forward and read his card. His shoulders stiffened as he realized this was deliberate. That's not my name, he said quietly. Why doesn't it say Mason? It's a mistake, honey. Someone made a terrible mistake. No mistake, I assure you. Eleanor appeared behind them, resplendent in a midnight blue gown dripping with diamonds. At 70, she remained commanding, her expression one of calculated amusement. I considered labeling you as leftover guest. More accurate, don't you think? The casual cruelty stole Audrey's breath. Grandmother? Mason stepped forward. My name is Mason. Not her son. Eleanor looked down as if noticing a small dog had barked. Children should be seen and not heard, dear. Why don't you find the other offspring? Mason didn't move, reaching for Audrey's hand. We'll sit here, thank you, Audrey said. Since you've gone to such trouble to assign us these seats. As you wish. I suppose it's fitting that you remain where you belong, on the periphery. Eleanor turned to leave. Oh, Victor is eager to say hello. He's brought Cassandra, Harvard-educated, from the Blackwell shipping family. Quite suitable. The emphasis on suitable was unmistakable. Mom? Do you want to leave? Mason asked. No. We were invited, and we'll stay. They sat alone as curious guests would approach, read their place cards, and quickly move away with poorly concealed amusement. No one joined their table. Across the ballroom, Victor stood with a tall blonde in a designer red dress. He caught Audrey's eye briefly before whispering something to his companion that made her laugh. "Dad's here," Mason said. "Can I go say hi?" They approached Victor, who straightened, his smile becoming fixed. "Mason, hey, buddy. You've grown so much." "It's been 3 months," Mason replied simply. Victor had cancelled their last 2 visits. "Audrey," Victor acknowledged with a nod. "This is Cassandra Blackwell." Eleanor approached them. "Victor, darling, they're about to serve the food. You and Cassandra should take your seats at the main table." Her gaze flicked dismissively over Audrey. "I see you've greeted your previous attachments." One woman with Eleanor frowned. "Eleanor, isn't that rather honest, Harriet?" "Yes, I've always believed in calling things what they are. I wanted to ensure everyone understood the relationships involved." Victor shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. His silence hurt more than Eleanor's words. "We can see the label clearly," Audrey replied steadily. "Very creative labeling system you have." With barely a backward glance, Victor allowed himself to be led away. "I'll catch up with you later, Mason," he called over his shoulder. "He didn't even ask about my science fair project," Mason said quietly. Throughout dinner, they remained isolated. Halfway through the main course, Eleanor rose for a speech. "Family has always been the cornerstone of my life," she declared. "The Hamilton name stands for excellence and proper values. Some of you may recall a period when our family weathered certain, questionable associations." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "But as I've always said, everyone makes youthful mistakes. The measure of character is how one corrects one's own life course." "Mom," Mason whispered, "she's talking about us, isn't she?" Audrey nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Victor then stood. "Thank you, Mother, for everything you've taught me. You were right about so many things. To making the right choices, even when they come later than they should." "Mom?" "I don't feel good," Mason said, tears welling in his eyes. "We can leave," she whispered. Mason shook his head. "No. They want us to leave. That's why they're being mean." Later, Eleanor approached their table. "I noticed you enjoyed the meal. I wasn't certain what cuisine you might be accustomed to these days." "It was lovely, thank you. Your hospitality is exactly what I expected." Harriet spoke up. "Eleanor, really, the place cards were in poor taste. The boy's name is Mason, for heaven's sake." "I wanted to make sure everyone understood exactly who had been permitted to attend," Eleanor replied coldly. Victor appeared, whispering to his mother, "This'll be fun, won't it? Getting it all over with at once." A waiter rushing past caught his tray on a chair. The crash of shattering crystal momentarily silenced the room. In the quiet, Harriet's voice carried clearly, "Those place cards were simply cruel." Even for Eleanor, that was too much. Mason carefully folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. His expression transformed from hurt to something more resolved. "Mason? What is it?" He squeezed her hand, his eyes surprisingly clear. "It's okay, Mom. Everything's going to be okay." Something had shifted in him, the wounded child was gone, replaced by someone with purpose. He straightened his shoulders as Eleanor prepared to make another speech. "What are you thinking?" Audrey whispered anxiously. "I know what I need to do," Mason replied, his voice steady beyond his 9 years. "Remember what you always say? That the truth is the most important thing, even when it's hard?" Before Audrey could respond, he stood up, already walking purposefully toward the center of the room, toward Eleanor and the microphone that awaited her birthday speech. Every head in the ballroom turned as Mason walked deliberately toward the center of the room. His small figure in his thrift store suit seemed out of place amid the luxury, yet there was a dignified certainty in his steps that commanded attention. "Mason," Audrey called softly, rising from her chair. But something held her back from stopping him, perhaps the transformation she'd witnessed in his eyes. Eleanor stood beside a three-tiered birthday cake ablaze with candles, microphone in hand, momentarily frozen as she noticed the boy approaching. Her perfectly composed features quickly masked confusion with a condescending smile. "It seems the younger generation is eager to offer birthday wishes," she said into the microphone, drawing polite laughter. "How charming." Mason continued forward until he stood directly in front of his grandmother. Despite their height difference, he looked directly into her eyes with a steadiness that visibly unsettled her. "May I have the microphone, please?" he asked, his voice clear and surprisingly calm. Eleanor's smile tightened. "This is hardly the time for children's performances, dear. Return to your seat." "I need to say something important," Mason persisted. "About what I heard at Uncle Philip's house 2 weeks ago." A hush fell over the room. At the main table, Victor straightened, a flash of alarm crossing his face. Near the wall, an older gentleman with silver hair, Philip Hamilton, set down his champagne glass, his expression shifting to one of dismay. "This is inappropriate. Victor, please control your..." "Let him speak, Eleanor." The voice came from Philip, who had risen from his seat. "The boy has something to say. Perhaps we should all listen." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's authority was rarely challenged, especially in public. Her face hardened, but before she could respond, Victor stepped forward and took the microphone. "Hey, buddy, this isn't the time," he said, placing a hand on Mason's shoulder to guide him away. "We can talk later, okay?" Mason didn't move. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, its pages dog-eared and covered with a child's careful handwriting. "My teacher, Ms. Gonzalez, says we should write down things that confuse or upset us," he explained, his voice carrying in the silent room. "She says it helps us understand our feelings and solve problems." Audrey watched from her position halfway across the room, her heart pounding. She recognized the notebook, Mason's thinking journal, from school. Mason opened the notebook and looked up at his father. 2 weeks ago, I went to Uncle Philip's house to return the astronomy book he lent me. The door was open, but no one answered when I knocked, so I went in and called out." Victor's face had grown pale. "Mason, this isn't appropriate." "I heard voices in the study," Mason continued steadily. "You were there with grandmother. You didn't know I was in the hallway." The room had grown so quiet that the soft turning of the notebook page seemed loud. Eleanor reached for the microphone, but Philip stepped between them, shaking his head slightly. "You were laughing about the invitation you sent us," Mason said, his voice smaller now but still clear. "Grandmother, you said you were going to put single mom/ex-wife on Mom's place card. You said that was funny and would make her uncomfortable." Gasps and whispers broke out across the ballroom. Audrey felt her cheeks burning, but also a surge of pride for her son's courage. "Grandmother, you said," Mason glanced down at his notebook. "Leftover guest, for leftover people. And you laughed, Dad. You said, this'll be fun to watch." Victor's face was drained of all color. He tried to put his arm around Mason, but the boy stepped away. "Children often misunderstand adult conversations," Eleanor said loudly, regaining her composure. "This is precisely why they shouldn't eavesdrop. Victor, take the boy back to his seat." "I wrote it down exactly," Mason insisted, holding up his notebook. "I can read more if you want. About how you said Mom wasn't good enough because she's just a waitress. About how you were glad Dad finally came to his senses and found someone appropriate." A woman at a nearby table stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "Eleanor, is this true? Did you deliberately humiliate that woman and her child?" More guests began to murmur, the atmosphere in the room shifting palpably. "This is absurd," Eleanor scoffed. "Absurd imaginations of a child who clearly hasn't been taught proper behavior." It's not absurd, a new voice stated firmly. Philip had stepped forward, taking the microphone from Victor's slack grip. And it's not imagination. I was there that day, in my own home. I heard this conversation, word for word, as the boy has described it. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Eleanor's face contorted with fury. Philip, you're making a scene, she hissed. No, Eleanor, he replied calmly into the microphone. You made the scene when you decided to publicly humiliate a woman and child who have done nothing wrong except for not fitting in your narrow definition of worth. He turned to address the crowd. I've stood by for years watching my sister-in-law's cruelty, telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere. Today, I'm ashamed to admit that a 9-year-old boy showed more courage and integrity than I have in decades. Audrey had made her way to Mason's side, placing a protective arm around his shoulders. She felt him trembling slightly but standing firm. Eleanor snatched the microphone from Philip. This is preposterous. Victor, say something. All eyes turned to Victor, who stood looking trapped between his mother and his son. For a moment, he seemed to shrink under the collective gaze, his usual confidence evaporating. Is that really what I said? He asked quietly, his voice breaking slightly. That it would be fun to watch? Mason nodded, his expression solemn. You said it would have finally put things in perspective for her. I wrote it all down. Victor closed his eyes briefly, a pained expression crossing his face. When he opened them, he looked directly at Audrey. I'm sorry, he said, the words seeming to surprise even himself. I don't know who I've become. Mason turned to face the crowd, his small voice steady. I just wanted everyone to know that my mom isn't a leftover person. She works harder than anyone. She wakes up at 4 a.m. to make my lunch before her shift. She helps me with homework even when she's tired. She taught me that what matters is how you treat people, not how much money you have. His simple words hung in the air, more powerful than any elaborate speech. Audrey felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. A slow, deliberate clap broke the silence. Harriet was applauding. Well said, young man. Well said indeed. Another person joined in, then another. Soon, applause spread across the ballroom, genuine appreciation for the truth that had been spoken. Eleanor's face flushed crimson. This is my birthday celebration, she snapped, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Mason turned to Audrey, suddenly looking very much like a 9-year-old again. Can we go home now, Mom? Audrey nodded, finding her voice at last. Yes, honey. I think we've said what needed to be said. As they turned to leave, the crowd parted before them. Some faces showed admiration, others displayed the discomfort of those forced to confront their own complicity in casual cruelty. Victor stepped forward, blocking their path momentarily. Audrey, Mason, wait. Not now, Victor, Audrey said quietly. Maybe someday, but not tonight. Will you call me tomorrow? He asked, something like genuine regret in his eyes. Please? I need to. I want to talk to Mason. To both of you. Audrey studied his face, seeing perhaps the first glimpse of the man she'd once loved. We'll see, she said simply. With Mason's hand firmly in hers, she walked through the ballroom with her head held high. The whispers that followed them now held a different tone, not mockery but something closer to respect. As they reached the exit, Mason looked up at her. Did I do okay, Mom? Audrey knelt to his level, no longer caring who watched. You did more than okay. You were brave and honest and everything I've ever hoped you would be. I am so proud of you. They stepped into the cool night air, leaving behind the glittering party and its hollow pretensions. A waiting taxi pulled up, summoned by someone inside, perhaps Philip or one of the guests moved by what they'd witnessed. As they settled into the back seat, Mason leaned against her shoulder. We really are the best team, aren't we? Audrey put her arm around him, feeling a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying all these years. The absolute best, she agreed. Where to? The taxi driver asked. Home, Audrey replied, the word carrying a new sense of contentment. We're going home. The taxi pulled away from the Brighton Royal Hotel. Through the rear window, Audrey watched the glittering lights growing smaller. Mom. Mason's voice was small now. I'm sorry, I didn't tell you what I was going to do. Audrey turned to her son. Don't apologize for speaking the truth. I thought you'd stop me if I told you, he admitted. You're probably right. A comfortable silence settled between them, a shared understanding that something had shifted in their world tonight. Do you think grandmother hates me now? Mason asked eventually. I think grandmother isn't used to people standing up to her. Sometimes people get angry before they can understand why they were wrong. Mason nodded. Like when I got mad at Joey about the multiplication, but then realized I was just embarrassed? Exactly like that, Audrey replied. Growing up means facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Dad looked sad. Not angry, just sad. Sometimes people get lost trying to please others. They forget who they really are. Will he find his way back? She squeezed his hand. I don't know, honey. That's up to him. The taxi wound through familiar streets. The contrast with the opulence they'd left behind was stark, yet Audrey felt no regret. I used to worry that I couldn't give you what Victor's family has, the big house, the fancy schools. I felt like I was failing you. Mason looked up. But we have the important stuff. And what's that again? Love, he answered. Honesty. Kindness. Hard work. And chocolate chip pancakes on Sundays. Audrey laughed, the sound surprisingly light. Especially the pancakes. As they approached their building, Audrey felt a peace settling over her. For years, she'd carried the weight of Eleanor's judgment and Victor's rejection. Tonight, that burden had been lifted. Home sweet home, the taxi driver announced. Their apartment welcomed them with its familiar comfort. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, built with love and determination. Hot chocolate before bed, she offered. As Audrey heated milk, her phone buzzed with a text from Victor, I don't expect forgiveness. Mason showed incredible courage tonight. He reminds me of you. That's the highest compliment I can give. She set the phone down without replying. Tomorrow would be time enough for complex adult negotiations. Tonight was for celebrating her son's bravery. As they sat together with their hot chocolate, Audrey felt a certainty she hadn't known in years. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, not as a single mom hand at her son, but as Audrey and Mason Mitchell, the best team in the world. 6 months later. Morning sunlight filled Audrey's place, a small cafe born from Philip Hamilton's investment after the birthday party incident. Audrey arranged fresh pastries behind the counter, her dream finally realized. Your usual, Harriet, she asked Harriet, who had become a regular, bringing society friends who discovered Audrey's talents transcended social boundaries. Victor then came in for his weekly visit with Mason. Their relationship remained complicated, but he was trying, attending school events and listening more than speaking. The speech competition is at 4, Audrey reminded him. That afternoon, Mason took the stage for the My Greatest Pride competition. My mom taught me that courage isn't about being fearless, he began. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared. Audrey fought tears as her son described not the confrontation at the hotel, but her daily courage, the early mornings, the sacrifices without complaint, the persistence despite obstacles. When he won first place, Audrey embraced him. I'm so proud of you. I learned from the best, he replied. A delivery person brought white roses with a card in Eleanor's handwriting. Congratulations, Mason. Your grandmother was wrong. I am sorry. Not forgiveness yet, but a beginning. Walking home, Mason asked, Mom? Are we still the best team ever? Audrey looked at her son, still a child but with surprising wisdom. Always. The very best. Forever, he smiled. Forever, she confirmed, feeling the rightness of their world, defined not by what they lacked, but by the abundance of what truly mattered.